Macroeconomists are faced with some of the most difficult questions in the world. What to do when faced with scarcity? How do we deal with an economy with high unemployment or high inflation? To come to answers on how to deal with these very important questions, economists always fall back upon something which we call the economic way of thinking. And what I want to do in this video is give you a summary of some of the things that we do in macroeconomics, not necessarily micro, but in macroeconomics, to think about problems like unemployment and inflation and economic growth. The economic way of thinking is essentially a cost-benefit type of thinking, where we will look at what will an action do for us and what will it cost us to take this action, and we will compare one against the other. Now that sounds kind of cold-hearted, well, and objective. Well, it is. It is, however, what we're supposed to do. We got to remove our emotions, look at a problem with a skeptical eye, come up with a true reflection of the cost of an action and the benefits of an action, and then decide whether or not we should do what we want to do. What we often do in coming up with this cost-benefit analysis is create what is called a hypothesis, or simply a statement of what we think is true. And then we try to prove or disprove that particular hypothesis. We use data and models and analysis and thinking to try to determine if a rise in the money supply will lead to a fall in the interest rate, which would lead to an improvement in economic growth because people spend more. Now, there would be this hypothesis that there is a connection between the interest rate and people spending. And what we would do then is we would go out and we would test whether or not that relationship exists. Then we would have to make the answer the question, is this in our best interest at this moment? What are the costs of doing it and what are the benefits? Now, taking this idea of cost-benefit analysis to the macro level, there was a gentleman named Hazlitt who in the 1940s wrote a book called Economics in One Lesson. On the slide, you can see his one lesson. This is an important summary of what I would call macroeconomic cost-benefit analysis. What is important here is the following. What Hazlitt wants you to understand first off is that economics is an art more than a science. Because what we're doing is we're applying ideas to the real world full of people and corporations and governments and everything else that could make things very difficult to understand, and trying to come up with a policy that will improve conditions. The only way to truly determine through cost-benefit analysis whether or not an action, a monetary policy, a fiscal policy really can work, we've got to use his direction that we should look at two things. First off, it is absolutely important that you look at not just the short-run effects of a policy, but the long-run effects as well. Because it could be something that will make you feel good in the short run, will destroy you in the long run. An example of this could be printing of money. An economy may be stalling. One thing we could do to make people feel richer, give them more money. When they go out to buy food, they'll have more money. Now, temporarily, the households will be better off. But this will lead to long-term destruction in the form of inflation. What will eventually happen is all of this money will begin to filter through the economy. There aren't any resources with which to buy from this economy because nothing's been produced to match this increase in the money supply, and prices will simply rise. So the short-term consequence looks good, but the long-term consequence can be much more damaging. That's why most countries have decided not to go into printing of money as a means of short-run economic change. Now, the second part that Hazlitt looks at is that anytime you look at a policy, you must take into account that it affects groups of people differently. Let's take again, for example, a monetary policy. And what has happened in the United States over the Great Recession of 2007, 2009 was a lowering of interest rates. Now, for anybody who's buying a car or a home or student loans, this was a wonderful outcome because it costs less for you to borrow this money. So you would think, well, this has to be a good policy. It's going to stimulate the economy in the short run. It may not hurt the economy in the long run, and I'm being benefited by these lower interest rates. Well, that may be true. But what if you're retired? And what if you have most of your money in the bank? And you've been dependent upon the interest earned from that money as your means of living? What happens if the bank, instead of giving you 5% interest, will now give you 0.5% interest because the Federal Reserve has lowered the interest rate. What happens is grandma and grandpa have no cash flow. They have no new money with which to buy food. And instead of using the income from their savings, they have to actually dip into their savings. So a drop in the interest rate could be good for many, many people. It also can be bad. Now, what has to happen, of course, what we're talking about, the art of economics, is that the policymaker is going to have to weigh the good that is the benefits that come to you and me who are buying homes and cars and credit cards, and the negatives that happen to grandma and grandpa. And we have to weigh one against the other and decide short run, long run, which is going to be the best outcome. Economists must always be aware of both of these aspects that Hazlitt's talking about. Always consider the long run consequences of your short run actions. Always look at everybody involved, not just those whom you are trying to help. Now, when trying to compute these benefits, the economic way of thinking insists that we look at what is called the margin. I don't want to look at costs and benefits based on activities over the past 10 years. I want to limit it to something very simple. Let's take the case of a worker trying to decide, am I going to go to work today and put in an hour's work? Well, the thing that will make that person make that decision is the marginal benefit versus the marginal cost. And it has to do with an action only in the future, not in the past. So we make the decision, okay, I'm going to work one more hour. What will be my pay for that one additional hour? Now, if workers recognize that by working one more hour, they will be paid their normal wage, let's say that's $15 an hour, and they get to take home 14 of that and only $1 is taken out in taxes, the worker may decide, therefore, the net cost to me, or the marginal cost to me, is 1 hour of my time to work, but the marginal benefit to me is $14 in take-home pay. This person would probably take that action. But what if you have a country that decides that this person has already earned enough money up till now? They have already earned $100,000. And what we're going to do now is if they work even one more hour, we're going to take most of it. So what if you had a situation where the worker goes to work and he earns $15 an hour, but the government takes $14 and the worker gets to take home $1? Would the worker go to work? You see, the cost-benefit analysis has nothing to do with the fact that they've already earned $100,000. It has nothing to do with the past. The decision to go to work or not go to work depends solely on the marginal benefit versus the marginal cost of the next step. There's a very good chance that if this worker is given the choice between going to work and a cost of 1 hour of my time and the benefit of $1 in take-home pay, that the worker will not do this. So you see that cost benefit is always measured at the margin. It is not measured on average. Secondly, even if the worker has gone to great lengths to come to work in his car, he's sunk all of his time into getting to work, he's ready to step on the floor to do his job, that's irrelevant. All that matters is if he takes the 1 hour, how much money does he get paid? It is not the sunk cost of everything leading up to it, it's only the marginal cost and marginal benefit looking forward. This is one of the most important things about the economic way of thinking with regard to monetary fiscal policy or economic growth. Now, when trying to find the true cost and the true benefits of any marginal action, the best place is to look at markets. Because one possibility is to simply make a decision by some enlightened decision maker who happens to be, I don't know, president or the Speaker of the House or the head of the Federal Reserve, that this particular person or a group of people think that they know best who is going to benefit and who is going to absorb costs. And they're going to assign what the benefits and costs are. Well, the best way to determine what the true benefit is to allow the people to tell you. And they will do that simply they'll reveal it to you by their actions. If workers find that it simply is not worth going to work if the government's going to take 50% of everything I make, then workers will simply let the market be known that we're not coming to work, and we will see that production will fall. They will have to come up with a rate of taxation or a rate of compensation which will be enough to bring the workers to work. This can only be revealed most efficiently through a market. The information that is needed to operate an economy is spread all around the economy. It is not located in one computer or one person's mind. This is an important thing you must recognize, that an economy is the actions of many, and only by the free actions of these many can we reveal the true cost and the true benefits that come from any kind of action. Now, you're going to learn in the MBA program, you're going to have both microeconomics, that's Econ 555, and then you're going to have macroeconomics, and this is Econ 509. You might think that economists, since we're all economists, that we would all be thinking exactly the same way. And that would not quite be right. Now, every economist is grounded in both micro and macro. When we go to graduate school, we have to learn about both of these. And I will admit as a macroeconomist that microeconomics is the foundation of all economic thinking. This might, however, lead you to a false conclusion that if you simply take microeconomic ideas and transport them into a macroeconomic world, that you will have all you need to understand the macroeconomy. And this would be wrong. It turns out that the way that people act in mass as a group is often different than how they would act individually in an individual situation. Where you would hope that an individual would be basically rational, it is possible for groups of people to be almost irrational. For there to be efficiency in the micro world, you can get that clearly and easily through markets revealing what's going to happen. In macro, sometimes markets fail. Only for a short while, but the markets can fail. The study of applied macroeconomics is not the study of applying micro to macro. It is a world where people are influenced by institutions, not just by their own desires. They're influenced by outside policymakers, such as monetary and fiscal policy, not only by themselves and their employer or themselves and the store from which they're buying their television. There are all these outside influences that can affect what happens in the macro world. So micro, macro, they're both economics. Many of the things that you learn in micro are transportable into macro, but do not make the assumption that the rationality and the efficiency you see in micro can be fully transported to the macro. Economists agree on many, many things, but most of those things tend to be micro. Where economists get into big debates, when you hear us fighting on television about some policy, it is invariably a macroeconomic question, because that's where the noise is, that's where the imprecision is, that's where you ask us to forecast the future. That's much more difficult when you're dealing with a macro world instead of a micro world. Now, when you're looking at the data, what happens is economists try to analyze these problems using massive quantities of data. You have to make sure that the data that you use meet two important criteria. First off, the data you use or the indicator you use should be valid. What I mean by valid is it must measure what it is you're trying to measure. If what I want to do is measure how hot a room is, I don't want the barometer, I want the temperature. So I will have to use some kind of thermometer to measure the temperature of the room. That is a valid indicator of the heat that is in that room. Now, when it comes to macroeconomics, this might sound so obvious, but it's not necessarily the case. So often I will hear people confuse gross domestic product with inflation, and inflation with unemployment, and unemployment with industrial production. These are very specific terms measuring very specific activities in the economy. And you must recognize and you must understand what it is that is being validly indicated by these data. Now, the second characteristic you would want to see in your macro data is that the data are reliable. And what I mean by that is every time that you go back to use these data, they give you results which you can count on. The one reason we use temperature as a sign of how hot it is in here, and why we would say, if you tell me it's 72, it's probably going to be comfortable. If you tell me it's 102, it's probably going to be uncomfortable. And if you tell me that it's 2, it's probably going to be very, very cold. Now, the reason I can say this without hesitation is because temperature gives me a reliable indication. So what we have found, for example, is that one way to try to capture how well the labor market is doing is to look at something called unemployment, and the percentage of the labor force which is not working but looking for work. because this is a reliable indicator of the strength of the market. When the market's not creating new jobs or the market is laying off people, the unemployment rate will rise. And if the opposite is happening, the unemployment rate will fall. So unemployment is a reliable indicator. But reliability can also go another way. It can be relationships between variables. So for example, we might find that every time the economy grows really fast for, say, a year, now not just growing fast, but it's been growing fast for a full year, that historically this has been associated with rising pressures for prices, rising inflationary pressures. This is what I also would mean by a reliable relationship. I'm looking at connections between two variables. And so if I can find a reliable connection between these two variables, I would refer to that as reliability as well. Now, here's where we come into this connection between what data do for us. What data do for us is provide signals. We constantly look at economic data to tell us how well the economy is doing. Just like if you were walking the streets and you wanted to know whether or not you should walk across a busy intersection, you would look for a signal. You would look for the walk signal or the don't walk signal. And it would tell you whether or not it is safe to proceed across the street. Well, the same thing would be true in economics. We will look for signals to tell us whether or not the economy is doing well or poorly, whether the labor market is doing well or poorly, whether we have a trade, we're competitive in trade with maybe a trade surplus, or we're not that competitive with a trade deficit. Now, these signals can come in two different forms. The first was what I would call a direct signal. That is where you're simply measuring what it is you're trying to measure. So if what you're trying to measure is the change in prices, and you create a price index called the Consumer Price Index, and you see that the Consumer Price Index rises, this is a direct signal. The CPI rising means that prices are rising. But there's also indirect signals. And this is where you get into these relationships between variables. And the one I talked about just a moment ago is an example of an indirect signal. So let us say we observe that the gross domestic product is growing strongly for an entire year. It's just booming. There's a very good chance that this is going to indirectly signal to me not just that GDP is rising, but indirectly that inflation may begin to rise. This is what I mean by an indirect signal, where you're measuring or you're looking at the information for something else. Okay, so a direct signal is what you're directly trying to measure. The CPI directly measures inflation. An indirect measure is where you're looking at a relationship between two variables. That rising GDP for a long period of time could be a sign of rising inflation in the near future. So signals, you listen sometime to television, read the Financial Times, read the commentaries by economists, and what you will see, they will look at data and try to interpret them. Look at more data, interpret them. This is the use of signals. Now, in these relationships between various variables, we have to be careful to look at the difference between what is called causation and correlation. Now, causation is where action A causes action B to occur. Correlation is where two things simply happen at the same time. They may or may not be a case of A causing B. They're both important in economics. The unfortunate thing is we can never prove either one. Even when it comes to causation, we are absolutely convinced that a rise in the money supply, everything else held constant, will cause a rise in general prices over time. We can even talk about the causation. We can say, I have a theory that tells me I think this is a line of causation. But we can never prove it. We can only infer it because we cannot directly observe X causing Y. There's a lot of time in between. So economists have an unfortunate situation where we can never prove causality. We can only infer it from the data that we have. So that's why we have so many models. That's why you see economists are just full of models, macro models, micro, economic models, graphs, and so forth, because we try to find relationships between variables. But in applied macro, we move even beyond what we think is causation. See, what you would always try to count upon are things that you can explain very clearly by a model. But you know, in the real world of macroeconomics, certain times things happen at the same time and we can't fully explain it. And we refer to this maybe as correlation. Now, macroeconomists, much more than microeconomists, will use correlation. But you must be very careful. If you cannot explain why the two things happened at the same time, or why X always followed Y, if you can't tell a good story to explain why this happened, then you're going to probably make a mistake if you depend upon it to make a forecast. Because it could be simply a one-time fluke that we've observed this connection between these two variables. And again, this is why economists go to great lengths to watch data over many, many years. Because what we try to do are we try to find these patterns. And once these patterns are really established, then we can begin to say that there could be causation here. And we develop theories that would explain it. But at minimum, at least we could find how much correlation there is and how dependable that correlation is. Correlation without a good story is a dangerous decision tool. Only use correlation when you can explain what it is you're looking at. Now, in looking at macroeconomic variables, many of them will be measured in currency units. The problem with that is that currency does not remain the same over time. The value of the dollar changes. These value changes we refer to as inflation or deflation. So a dollar today does not buy what a dollar would buy 25 years ago or even 1 year ago. Therefore, if you have two variables like gross domestic product measured in dollars, and they're measured in dollars as of some given day, and you try to compare the GDP today to the GDP 10 years ago, there's a very good chance you're comparing two things which are not comparable. You're comparing apples to oranges because what a dollar would buy 10 years ago is not equal to what a dollar would buy today. We call GDP, for example, measured in today's dollars, we call it current dollar GDP. The common word used in textbooks is nominal. So any economic variable measured in a currency unit that is measured in today's prices is called nominal. Your nominal wage, your nominal interest rate, your nominal GDP. But if you adjust those variables for changes in prices, then you move into the world of what we call real variables, and that's where macroeconomists spend their time. We want to take out the effects of changes in prices. To prove this point, I'm going to give you a very simple example, which I'm sure you will accept. Let's say you go into work, and your boss calls you into the office and says it's time for your annual review, and I'm going to give you a 3% raise. And this 3% raise reflects my confidence in you and how hard you have worked. And you smiled, and the boss is pumping you up about how good you are, and you got a raise, and this is great. And you go back to your office, and you pull up a website, and you look up what has been the inflation rate over the past year. And you find out that the inflation rate has been 3%. And your boss is giving you a 3% raise. Now, you know in nominal terms you did get a raise, and that's what your boss can always say. But you know in real terms you're no better off. Because everything you use that money for to buy costs 3% more. And therefore what you have a situation is while your nominal wage rose by 3%, your real wage did not rise at all. And for many American workers in the past 10 years or so, they've observed their wages going up in nominal terms by less than the cost of living, and therefore their wage in real terms has fallen. You know this is important, and therefore that difference between real and nominal is absolutely essential. With very few exceptions, economists will never compare nominal numbers. We will only focus upon real GDP versus over time. We will never compare GDP in nominal terms from, say, 1980 to 1990. In taking any macroeconomic variable, we often have to compare it to something. I've got to have a benchmark that I have in mind, and I can compare that to this benchmark. Earlier I was talking about temperature as a valid indicator of how much heat is in a room. See, you have a target. When would I be comfortable? And you might say that I would be comfortable at 72 degrees. So what happens is you will measure the actual room temperature, not in its total temperature, but rather you will compare, you will say it's too hot. What you mean by too hot, it is more than 72 degrees, which is at the point I would be comfortable. Or you will say it is too cold. It is not too cold in any absolute sense. What you are saying, and it makes perfect sense to all of us, we do this all the time. What I mean by that is it is colder than what I would have as my target or my ideal. So this idea of what we do in macro is exactly the same thing. We have targets. For example, I'm going to teach you later on that we set a target for the size of gross domestic product. How quickly do we want gross domestic product to grow? There's got to be an ideal number. And then what we do is we compare the actual growth rate of real GDP to its target rate. We do the same thing, for example, with unemployment. Unemployment is at the time of this taping is 9.5%. Well, is that good or bad? Well, it depends. If 9.5% is our target, and this is what the best we've ever done, then 9.5 is fine. But if we know that the target rate of unemployment that most of us have in mind is about 4.5, then we know that unemployment is high. The idea that unemployment is high right now only makes sense if you set a target. And so what happens in macroeconomics is we are constantly setting targets. And the policymakers will do it. For example, the Federal Reserve has a target rate for inflation. They don't tell us what it is, by the way. But they know they want inflation to remain below 2%, 2.4%. And what will happen is if inflation starts to get higher than that, the Fed will take actions to bring the inflation rate back down. So the action of the Fed only makes sense if you understand that they have this target in mind. Now, to understand fully what is happening with any variable, you must understand the context. And now here's my example of context and the importance of context in a macroeconomic situation. I had mentioned to you earlier that if GDP has been growing, say for an entire year, and it's been booming, much higher than the target rate, that this is probably a sign that inflation is going to begin. But you see, this only makes sense in this context, in that the economy has been growing faster than we wanted to for about a year. What if you took an economy that is coming out of the worst recession since the Great Depression, like we just had, and the economy all of a sudden starts growing its potential, its target is 2.5, and all of a sudden it's growing 8%. Could you conclude, therefore, if it's growing at 8%, but the target is 2.5, that we're going to have inflation? And the answer is no, because you need the context. If you're coming out of a very bad recession, there's a very good chance that unemployment is very high. That you've only had growth for one period, we're not going to have a problem with demand and supply not equaling up. There's got to be lots of factories sitting idle, lots of workers sitting idle that we can begin to draw into the economy and produce more without creating inflation. So we get into this situation that without the context, we can draw very weird conclusions. So always, this is why economists, if you look at economists, macroeconomists, what we spend a lot of our time doing is plowing through data and building into our head numbers that we may not use for months at a time. But it provides us the context to understand the other numbers that are going to be coming up. So context is the reason why I will have to teach you many variables, why I will ask you to read all the time so that you understand any indicator that you have in terms of the economy as a whole. Now, the reason we have to have business conditions analysis is because the economy is unstable. We have to know, for example, where are we in the business cycle? Are we coming up on a turn in the business cycle? Is the business cycle going to change? For example, are we going to fall into a recession? Or are we going to go out of recession and into some kind of growing economy? This is necessary to do business conditions analysis because the economy doesn't go along in a nice, smooth path. It tends to go in these movements which we call the business cycle. And then thirdly, after we know where are we in the cycle, are we near a turn, we have to know what the policymakers are going to do because the policymakers, the central bank and the federal government, are going to affect us. And therefore, the reason we need to analyze the economy is because all these things will play out. The economy will be growing or not, it may be changing, and policymakers will try to change that. And you and I have to respond to all of it. And this is why a course in applied macroeconomics is absolutely essential. So what you have to do to be successful in this field is know these various variables, what it is they mean, what it is they measure validly, what signals do they send to me, both directly and indirectly. And I can only know that through theories and reading and time and experience. That's why almost all macroeconomists will utilize economic theory, but not only economic theory. We also have to use economic judgment. We have to use hypotheses. We combine all this stuff, data, models, judgment, correlation, causation, context, all of it is necessary to do macroeconomics well. You can see why this is really an art as opposed to a science. If it was truly a science, I could just do X, Y, Z, put it into a computer, touch a button, and it's over. That's not how macroeconomics works at all. Now, the one thing we do know, this gathering of economic data, using these models, it does give us something. Because we have plenty of evidence that if we tried to make a decision without the model, without the data, we would come up with a worse decision than doing it with the data and with the models. They've actually done controlled experiments to figure out, does this in fact work? And it does work. Now, this is not to say that macroeconomists get it right. We often get things wrong. Our forecasts sometimes are just so bad. But they would have been even worse had we not looked at the data, not looked at the models. Now, what will happen then is you will take these models and so forth, and it moves you from a world. See, if you try to make a decision where you don't have any idea what the outcome of an action will be, we refer to this as decision-making under uncertainty. If I raise interest rates, what will happen? Well, if you ask some person who knows nothing about economics, they won't know. And since they have no context, no idea of the probabilities of outcome, we refer to this as decision-making under uncertainty. This is what I'm trying to avoid. The alternative would be to make decision-making under certainty. But see, that's not economics. Certainty means the probability of an outcome of any action is 1.0. If I take this gizmo I've been using to flip these slides and I let it go, it's going to fall to the floor. That has a probability of 1.0. That's a certainty. That's not economics either. Economics is something in between. Economics is the world of risk, where we assign probabilities. And the whole reason we use the data and the models and the judgment and the forecast and the hypotheses is to come up with a statement of probability. If the Federal Reserve raises interest rates, the most likely outcome will be that the economy will slow. If they lower interest rates, the most likely outcome is that the economy will rise. Now, you can see that you cannot expect everything from macro. It is an imperfect art based upon data and hypotheses and so forth. Do not expect more than that. Do not expect that when an economist on TV says that the Fed should raise interest rates, that is the answer. There is no the answer. This is a very imprecise social science. It is not like chemistry or physics. And therefore, a good economist would never go so far as to say GDP will grow this quarter by 3.215%. We would never be so pretentious. We always give ranges because the real world is full of things that can make our forecasts go wrong. Next, you've got to make sure that you leave your emotions at home. Many of you may be very free market oriented. Some of you may be socialist. And you may want the world to be fair. Well, the world isn't fair. And those of you who are free market, you want in markets to work all the time. But you know what? I told you earlier on, markets don't always work all the time. Don't let your dogma get in the way. Don't let your politics get in the way. You may love or dislike the man who is currently president. Don't let that affect your economic analysis. Be as objective as you possibly can. Leave your emotions on the side. Look for the truth. Be what we call in academia disinterested. I don't want the outcome to be X. I want to learn the outcome. I want to learn the truth. If you have a preconceived outcome, you're going to lead yourself to that outcome no matter what. But if you can come to it disinterested, in other words, you don't care what the answer is, you want to find the answer, you want to find the truth, this will give you the best chance to come up with a forecast of the economy. So if you think of, okay, you like the guy who's president, and somebody asks you, how's the economy doing? What you want to say is, I want the economy to do well because I want my guy to do well. But if you look at all the data and you decide the economy's not doing well, this is what a good economist is going to have to do. You're going to have to forget your politics, forget your dogma, and search for the truth. The rest of the class will be an examination of these data, of the theories, of the models, of the correlation, of the art of macroeconomics.